The small-town police station in Coldwater, Maine had a reputation among officers, though not the kind you'd put in an official report. Built in the early 1900s, it had served as a courthouse and jail before becoming the local precinct. Over the years, officers swore they'd seen strange shadows, heard unexplainable whispers, and felt unseen presences in the building's damp, narrow hallways. Officer Laura Grant had heard the rumours, of course. She didn't put much stock in ghost stories, chalking it up to creaky floorboards and overactive imaginations. But during her first night shift at the station, something happened that made her question everything she thought she knew. The call that started it all. Laura's shift started as uneventfully as she'd expected. Coldwater wasn't exactly bustling with activity, and her task consisted mostly of organising reports and responding to the occasional traffic stop. By 10 p.m, she'd settled at her desk with a cup of stale coffee, scrolling through old case files. At precisely 11:15 p.m, the phone on her desk rang. The station's phone system was ancient, corded and heavy, with a loud, jarring ring that echoed through the empty building. "Coldwater Police Department, Officer Grant speaking," she said, picking up the receiver. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then a faint voice broke through, barely audible over the static. "Help me." Laura straightened in her chair. "Sir, are you in danger? Can you tell me your location?" The voice didn't respond. Instead, there was a faint sound in the background, like someone whispering rapidly, too quiet to make out. "Hello? Sir, are you there?" Laura tried again. The line went dead. She frowned, setting the receiver back in its cradle. Probably a prank call, she thought, though something about the voice unsettled her. It wasn't just the faintness of it. There had been something off, like it didn't belong on the other end of the line at all. The disturbance. Around midnight, Laura heard the first noise. It was subtle at first, just a faint creaking, like footsteps on the second floor. She looked up from her paperwork, her hand instinctively going to her radio. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the quiet station. "If someone's in here, you need to identify yourself." The creaking stopped. The second floor had been out of use for years. It had once served as the station's holding area, but after the cells were decommissioned, it became a dumping ground for old files and furniture. Laura had been up there once during training, and it had given her the creeps. The dim lighting, the damp smell, and the lingering sense of confinement had made her glad she worked downstairs. Grabbing her flashlight, Laura made her way to the staircase. The beam of light cut through the darkness as she climbed the creaky wooden steps. At the top, the air felt colder, and the faint smell of mildew tickled her nose. "Coldwater PD," she called out. "If you're up here, this is trespassing. Come out with your hands up." The silence that followed was deafening. The cells. Laura moved down the hallway, her flashlight illuminating rows of empty cells. Most of the doors hung open, their rusty hinges squeaking faintly as the cold draft moved through. She paused outside one of the cells, her light catching something scratched into the wall. It was a word, crudely etched into the stone. "Stay." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She reached out to touch the markings, her fingers brushing against the jagged grooves. They looked old, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't always been there. As she turned to leave, she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "Don't go." Her heart raced. "Who's there?" she demanded, spinning around with her flashlight. The beam caught movement at the far end of the hallway, a shadow darting into one of the cells. "Stop right there!" Laura shouted, her voice echoing in the confined space. She drew her weapon and approached the cell cautiously, but when she got there, it was empty. Officer James Holloway had spent the last 15 years patrolling the streets of Ridgecrest, a sleepy town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. The work was steady and predictable. Domestic disputes, noise complaints, the occasional drunk tank fill-up. Ridgecrest didn't see much serious crime, and that's the way James liked it. But every town has its shadows, and Ridgecrest's darkest corner was Marlow Road. Everyone knew Marlow Road was cursed. It was an unlit stretch that wound through thick woods before tapering off into nothingness. In the 1970s, a prison transport van vanished there without a trace. A decade later, a young woman disappeared while driving home from a late shift. Her car was found with the engine running, the driver's door wide open, but no sign of her. Over the years, stories accumulated. Some said the road was haunted by the prisoners who vanished. Others believed it was a thin place, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. The locals avoided it after dark, but for the Ridgecrest Police Department, Marlow Road was just another part of the patrol. James thought the stories were nonsense, or at least he had until the night he answered the call. The call. It was 11:47 p.m. on a cold November night when the dispatch crackled in his cruiser. Unit 2-4, we've got a report of suspicious activity near mile marker 13 on Marlow Road. Caller says they saw a man standing in the road, holding a lantern. No further details. James sighed. Mile marker 13 was smack in the middle of the road's most isolated stretch. It would take him 15 minutes to get there, and he doubted it was anything serious. Probably some teenager playing pranks or a lost hiker. "Copy that, dispatch," James said, turning his cruiser onto Marlow Road. The drive was uneventful at first. His headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt and the skeletal trees that lined the road. The farther he went, the more the forest seemed to close in, the branches overhead forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The radio emitted faint static, which grew louder the closer he got to mile marker 13. "Great," James muttered. The department's radios were notoriously unreliable in remote areas. As he neared the marker, he slowed the car. His headlights swept across the road, but there was no sign of anyone. He pulled over and grabbed his flashlight, stepping out into the biting cold. "Clearwater PD," he called out, his voice echoing through the stillness. "Is anyone out here?" No response. James swept his flashlight across the trees. The beam caught a faint shimmer in the distance, a light, flickering like a candle. "Hello," he called, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. The light didn't move. Cautiously, James stepped off the road and into the woods. The lantern. The forest was eerily quiet. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, absent. James's boots crunched on the frozen ground as he moved toward the light. It flickered in and out of view as though someone were walking ahead of him just out of reach. "Sir, this is the police. Stop where you are," James commanded, his voice firm. The light paused. For a moment, everything was still. Then it began to move again, faster this time, darting deeper into the woods. James cursed under his breath and quickened his pace. The underbrush clawed at his uniform, and his flashlight beam wavered as he stumbled over roots and rocks. The light ahead grew brighter, and he could make out a figure holding the lantern. "Stop!" James shouted. "You're trespassing!" The figure stopped abruptly. James froze, his flashlight trained on the man. He was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the shadows cast by the lantern. He wore a tattered coat, the kind you'd see in old photographs of loggers or railroad workers. "Sir, I need you to turn around and identify yourself," James said, his voice steady. The man didn't move. Slowly he lifted the lantern higher, and James's stomach dropped. The lantern wasn't casting light, it was casting shadows, unnatural, writhing shapes that twisted and coiled around the man like living things. Before James could react, the figure turned and walked deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, James followed. The clearing, the forest grew darker and colder the farther he went. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming grotesque shapes. James's flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each step. "Dispatch, this is Unit 2-4, James said into his radio. "I'm in pursuit of a suspect in the woods near mile marker 13. Request backup." The radio crackled, but instead of the dispatcher's voice, James heard faint whispers. He couldn't make out the words, but they were urgent, insistent. "Turn back." James ignored them. He pushed forward until he stumbled into a clearing. The lantern was there, hanging from a branch, its shadows writhing across the ground. Beneath it lay something that made James's blood run cold. A row of bodies, lined up neatly in the dirt. They were in various states of decay, their hollow eyes staring up at the sky. Some were dressed in modern clothing, while others wore uniforms that looked decades old. Prison uniforms. James's breath hitched as he stepped closer. His flashlight illuminated the face of the nearest body. It was Officer Mark Phillips, a fellow cop who had gone missing on patrol 5 years earlier. "No," James whispered, his mind reeling. The shadows cast by the lantern began to move, pooling together into a single shape. A towering figure rose from the darkness, its form indistinct but filled with malice. Its hollow eyes locked onto James, and a voice like 100 whispers filled the air. "You shouldn't have come." The escape. James stumbled back, drawing his weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice quavered. The figure didn't listen. It moved toward him, the shadows stretching out like tendrils. James fired, the gunshots echoing through the clearing, but the bullets passed through the figure harmlessly. The shadows surged forward, enveloping him. James felt an icy coldness seep into his skin, his vision darkening as the whispers grew louder. Summoning all his strength, he broke free and ran. He didn't know which direction he was going. He just ran, crashing through the underbrush, the shadows snapping at his heels. Finally, he burst out onto Marlow Road, gasping for air. His cruiser was just ahead, its lights still flashing. He threw himself inside and slammed the door, his hands trembling as he started the engine. The shadows lingered at the edge of the woods, watching as he sped away. Aftermath. James never spoke about what he saw that night. He filed a report about an unsubstantiated disturbance and quietly requested a transfer. But he couldn't shake the image of the bodies or the figure in the shadows. Months later, a rookie officer named Lisa Thompson took a call about a disturbance on Marlow Road. When she reached mile marker 13, she found James's cruiser abandoned, its engine still running. Inside, scrawled in the condensation on the windshield, was a single word: run. This story weaves a chilling narrative with vivid imagery, a creeping sense of dread, and a twist ending to leave readers haunted. For most police officers, the first year of their career is a mixture of excitement, nerves, and uncertainty. They hear stories of the job's darker side, but dismiss them as exaggerated tales, ghosts of old-timers who've seen too much. But for Officer Matthew Lawson, his first year would break the illusion and force him to confront something that even the oldest officers at the East Pine Police Department had trouble explaining. East Pine was a small town in the heart of West Virginia, known for its towering pines, winding roads, and the kind of eerie silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Most of the residents had lived there their whole lives, content in their isolation. But there were always stories, rumors, whispered conversations that made their way from house to house, bar to bar, often forgotten, but never quite gone. Matthew had been warned about the haunted parts of town, the places where officers had gone missing or found something they couldn't quite explain. He didn't take them seriously. After all, there were always explanations for things that seemed too strange to be real. That was until the night that would change everything. The unseen caller. It was late October, and the night had fallen heavy with a chilling fog that crept in from the mountains. The moon barely pierced the thick veil of mist, casting an unsettling pallor over the quiet streets. Officer Lawson was assigned to patrol the quieter outskirts of town that night, a task that he'd come to dread during the foggy season. The radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the silence. Unit 4, we've got a 911 call from the old Miller farm on Chestnut Lane. Caller reports hearing noises from the woods behind their house. Says it's been going on for hours. Suspects a break-in. Over. Matthew sighed and adjusted his grip on the wheel. The Miller farm was one of the most remote properties in East Pine. The area had always been the subject of ghost stories, strange lights, shadows, and eerie sounds that people couldn't explain. There was always some mystery surrounding the land, something that the locals preferred not to talk about. "I've got it," Matthew replied, though his voice lacked the confidence he tried to project. He hadn't taken many calls like this, but something about the Miller farm always made him uneasy. The approach. As he drove toward Chestnut Lane, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping itself around his patrol car like a living thing. His headlights illuminated the twisting road ahead, and the trees on either side seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the sky. The farm came into view soon after, an old two-story house standing against the backdrop of the mist. Its windows were dark, but Matthew could see the faint glow of a porch light through the fog. The driveway was overgrown, and the house itself looked abandoned, save for the occasional flicker of light from within. Matthew parked at the end of the gravel drive and got out, the cool air biting at his skin. He glanced around. No one was in sight. The only sound was the distant call of an owl and the low hum of the fog pressing against the ground. It was too quiet. Walking to the front door, Matthew knocked twice. He waited, but there was no answer. He knocked again, this time a bit louder. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-60s, dressed in an old robe, her grey hair tied in a messy bun. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You're the officer?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Yes, ma'am. "Officer Lawson, I'm here to check on the disturbance you reported." She nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "My name is Clara Miller," she said, her voice quivering. I don't know how to explain it. I've been hearing things outside for the last couple of days. Noises in the woods. Not animals. It's something else. It sounds like footsteps, heavy footsteps, and whispering. It won't stop." Matthew felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't the first time he'd heard such claims, but something about Clara's demeanor told him she wasn't imagining things. She led him through the small living room, the air thick with dust. There was an oppressive, almost oppressive silence inside, as if the house had been abandoned for far longer than it actually had. He followed her to the back door, which opened to a small yard and then a dense patch of trees. The fog was thick here, swirling around the trunks of the towering pines like ghosts weaving through the darkness. "I hear them," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every night." Matthew scanned the yard. There was nothing, no movement. The only sign of life was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "Stay here," Matthew instructed, pulling out his flashlight and stepping into the yard. He approached the tree line, scanning the dark shadows for any sign of life. The woods felt different. The air was colder here, denser. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches swaying unnaturally in the wind. Something was off. He took a few more steps forward, the light from his flashlight barely making a dent in the darkness. The rustling he'd heard earlier seemed louder now, coming from deeper within the forest. His boots crunched on the leaves as he moved toward the sound. And then he saw it. A shadow. It was quick, darting between the trees. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't alone. "Who's there?" Matthew called out, his voice steady but with a trace of uncertainty. There was no answer, just the whispering wind and the rustling of leaves. He stepped closer to where he had seen the shadow, his hand on his gun, ready for whatever was out there. As he approached a large tree, he heard it again, a faint whisper. It sounded like a voice, but not one he could understand. His flashlight flicked back and forth, illuminating the trees around him, but there was nothing. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, tall, dark, and humanoid, standing motionless behind a tree. It was too tall to be a man, and too thin to be anything normal. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Matthew could feel its gaze on him, cold, unblinking, and wrong. Before he could react, the figure vanished into the trees, disappearing into the mist. He stood frozen, his heart racing. "Clara!" Matthew shouted, backing away slowly. "Get inside, now!" He turned and sprinted back to the house, not daring to look behind him. He could feel it. Something was following him just out of sight. The air seemed to press in on him, the trees closing in, and the whispering growing louder. He reached the back door and slammed it shut, his breath ragged in his chest. "What is it?" Clara asked, fear in her voice. I don't know," Matthew stammered, his mind racing, "but I'm not staying out there any longer." The aftermath. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Matthew stayed with Clara for the rest of his shift, though nothing more happened. The footsteps and the whispers seemed to stop once he had returned inside the house, but the unease in his gut never left. By the time dawn came, the fog had begun to lift and the trees stood still once again, their shadows stretching long in the early morning light. Clara had thanked him, though there was something different about the way she looked at him now, a knowing look, as if she had seen the same thing he had. Matthew never spoke about what happened that night, not to Clara, not to anyone. He tried to rationalize it, tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, that the isolation had played tricks on him. But every time he passed the Miller farm, every time the fog rolled in thick, he felt the same cold dread creeping into his bones. Months passed, but the strange events didn't stop. Other officers began reporting similar encounters, figures in the woods, shadows in the mist, whispers on the wind. Some of them left the force, unable to handle what they had seen. Those who stayed grew more and more distant, their eyes haunted by something they couldn't name. One night, as Matthew stood on patrol, he felt it again, the unease. He glanced up and saw the mist rolling in, thicker than usual. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the streets, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was the tall figure, the same one he had seen all those months ago. This time, Matthew didn't run. He stepped forward, his gun drawn, his hand steady. The figure didn't move. Instead, The whispering grew louder, filling his ears. It's always been here. It always will be. And in that moment, Matthew understood. The shadows weren't just in the woods, they were in the town, and they had always been watching. End. This story dives into the fear and unsettling mystery experienced by police officers who have to confront the supernatural forces hiding in plain sight. It explores themes of isolation, the unknown, and the chilling realization that some things can never be explained away. Officer Daniel Hayes always dreaded the midnight shift, but in Millfield County, that was the nature of the job. Millfield wasn't a big city, and it didn't see much action, mostly the occasional DUI, noise complaints, or teenagers pulling pranks. But there was one place every officer avoided like the plague: Red Creek. Red Creek wasn't marked on any modern map, and most of the locals treated it as a ghost story, a little farming community abandoned in the 1970s after an economic collapse. Rumours swirled about why the town really went silent. Some said it was because of toxic chemicals that poisoned the soil. Others whispered about darker things: cults, disappearances, and unspeakable rituals. But for Hayes, Red Creek was just an eerie relic of the past, a place no sane person would visit. Until the call came. It was a quiet October night, crisp and cloudless. Hayes sat in his cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee when the radio crackled to life. Unit 9-1, report of suspicious activity near Red Creek. Caller reported seeing lights and hearing shouting in the area. Please investigate. Hayes frowned. Who even went out there? The roads leading to Red Creek were barely passable. Still, a call was a call. Copy that, he replied, a hint of reluctance in his voice. Unit 9-1 en route. The drive to Red Creek took nearly 30 minutes, the road narrowing with every mile. Trees crowded the path, their skeletal branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The headlights of the cruiser barely pierced the oppressive darkness. Hayes could feel his nerves tightening, the air thick with an unspoken tension. When he finally reached the outskirts of Red Creek, he parked by the rusted remains of an old town sign. The words "Welcome to Red Creek" were barely visible beneath decades of grime and graffiti. Hayes stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand. The town was eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just a deep, suffocating stillness. He scanned the area, his light revealing crumbling buildings, overgrown weeds and rusted farming equipment. Then he saw it, a faint glow coming from the center of town. Dispatch, I've got visual on some lights. Proceeding to investigate. There was no response, just static. Hayes frowned but kept moving, his boots crunching on the gravel road. As he approached the source of the glow, he realized it was coming from the old church. The building was in better shape than the rest of the town, its steeple still standing tall against the dark sky. But the windows flickered with an unnatural light, as if a fire burned within. Hayes stepped onto the creaking porch and pushed open the door. The inside of the church was a jarring contrast to its exterior. The pews were pristine, the wooden floors polished to a shine. Candles lined the walls, their flames casting eerie shadows. At the center of the room stood an altar, and on it, a collection of objects: a blood-stained cloth, a knife, and a small wooden box. But what caught Hayes' attention was the figure kneeling before the altar. "Millfield PD," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. "Show me your hands." The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in tattered overalls, his head bowed. Hayes approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Sir, I need you to stand up and—" The man's head snapped upward, revealing hollow black eyes and a gaping mouth that stretched far too wide. Hayes stumbled back, his heart pounding. Before he could react, the man let out an ear-piercing scream, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Hayes scrambled for his flashlight, but when he flicked it on, the church was empty. The altar, the candles, the man, they were all gone. He was standing in a decrepit, dust-covered ruin. "Dispatch, I need backup at Red Creek immediately," he shouted into his radio. Static. He bolted out of the church, the cold night air hitting him like a wave. As he ran back toward his cruiser, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The lights were back. But this time, they weren't confined to the church. Every building in Red Creek was aglow, their windows illuminated by a pale, flickering light. Shadows moved within, dark figures darting past the glass. Hayes climbed into his cruiser, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal. The road seemed different on the way out, longer, more winding. The trees loomed closer, their branches scraping against the car like claws. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A procession of figures was following him, walking in perfect unison. Their faces were blank slates, featureless and glowing faintly in the dark. Hayes pushed the accelerator harder, the cruiser shuddering as it sped down the uneven road. He didn't stop until he reached the county line. When he finally pulled over, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 9-1. I'm clear of Red Creek, need immediate debriefing." There was a long pause before a voice crackled through. "Unit 9-1, we received no call for Red Creek tonight. Are you sure of your location?" Hayes stared at the radio, his stomach twisting. The voice on the other end sounded off, distorted, layered, as if multiple people were speaking at once. He looked back toward the road. In the distance, the faint lights of Red Creek still glowed, flickering like dying stars. Aftermath. Officer Hayes never returned to Red Creek. He filed his resignation a week later, citing personal reasons. But his colleagues noticed the change in him, how his hair seemed greyer, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. The rumors about Red Creek grew after that night. Other officers claimed they'd heard strange whispers over the radio, voices calling them to the abandoned town. A few brave or foolish rookies tried to investigate, but they always came back changed. As for Hayes, he disappeared 6 months later. His cruiser was found parked near the Millfield County line, the engine still running. The driver's seat was empty. No one dared look toward Red Creek that night. The town of Pine Hill had always been a quiet place, tucked away in the mountains of West Virginia. The streets were narrow, the buildings old, and the air always seemed thick with fog. Most of the residents had lived there their entire lives, and they liked it that way. There wasn't much to do except work, shop, and attend the occasional town meeting. But those who had lived in Pine Hill for long enough knew there were certain things in the town's history that should never be questioned. Stories that, if you asked the wrong person, might keep you up at night. For most of the officers working the Pine Hill Police Department, the job was routine. Mostly traffic stops, domestic disputes, and the occasional break-in. But for Officer Daniel Carter, a seasoned cop who had worked in Pine Hill for over 15 years, there were things that couldn't be explained. He had seen things that defied logic. And it wasn't just the fog that seemed to never lift, it was the things that walked beneath it. It was a chilly evening in late October when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, breaking the calm of the night shift. "Unit 6, we've got a 911 call from the corner of Maple and Elm. Caller reports hearing strange noises outside their house. They believe someone may be watching them, requesting police presence." Daniel looked over at his partner, Officer Emily Blake, who was driving the patrol car. She was young, new to Pine Hill, and eager to prove herself. Daniel had seen rookies like her come and go, all of them bright-eyed, thinking they could handle the job. He had no intention of scaring her, but he knew what was waiting for them. "Maple and Elm?" Emily asked, glancing at him. "Isn't that near the old church?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. He had heard the stories about the church. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. People said it was haunted, claimed they saw figures standing in the windows at night, staring out at the street, even though no one lived there. Daniel never gave much credence to ghost stories, but there were nights when even he couldn't deny the strange feeling that hung in the air near that place. "Yeah, that's the spot," Daniel replied, his voice low. "Let's check it out." The first encounter, the streets of Pine Hill were empty that night. The fog had rolled in thick, hanging low to the ground, shrouding everything in a greyish mist. As they approached the corner of Maple and Elm, Daniel felt his heart rate increase. The house the call had come from was a small, weathered home with a porch that creaked even in the calmest winds. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the dim light from the porch illuminated the dark street. They parked the patrol car at the curb and stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the fog like beacons in the dark. Daniel could feel the air grow colder as they walked toward the front door. Emily, following closely behind him, looked uneasy, glancing nervously at the house. "I'll knock," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You stay here, keep an eye out." Emily nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. She crossed her arms, shivering slightly, as Daniel walked up to the door and knocked 3 times. The sound of his knuckles against the wood seemed unusually loud in the stillness of the night. After a moment, the door creaked open. An older woman stood in the doorway, her grey hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were wide with fear, her face pale. "Officers," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you for coming. I don't know what's going on, but I keep hearing things outside. I think someone's been watching my house." "Ma'am, we'll take a look," Daniel said reassuringly. "Why don't you go inside and stay safe while we investigate?" The woman nodded, stepping back and closing the door softly behind her. Daniel turned to Emily. "Stay sharp," he muttered. "We'll check the perimeter first." The 2 officers made their way around the house, their flashlights scanning the dark yard. The fog was thicker here, the light from their flashlights barely penetrating the dense mist. As they reached the backyard, Daniel noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading into the woods behind the house. The tracks were fresh, the ground damp from the recent rain, but there was something off about them. They didn't look like normal human prints. They were too deep, too uneven, as though the person walking had been dragging something heavy behind them. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He motioned for Emily to stay back as he moved cautiously toward the trees. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Do you hear that?" Emily's voice broke the silence. Daniel froze. A faint rustling sound came from the woods, followed by what sounded like a low growl. It wasn't an animal. It was too low, too guttural. "Back to the house," Daniel said quickly, his hand moving toward his radio. "Dispatch, we have a situation here. We need backup immediately." But the radio crackled with only static. The hairs on his arms stood on end. "Emily," he whispered, "something's wrong." They turned to head back to the house, but before they could take a step, a shadow moved across the yard, crossing the beam of their flashlights. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel said, his hand resting on his gun. "Stay close. We're not alone." The shadow. As they approached the front door, the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The fog pressed in closer, almost suffocating. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, impossibly tall, with long, bony limbs. It moved quickly, too quickly, its form a shadow against the fog. Before Daniel could react, the figure was gone, disappearing into the mist as if it had never existed. "Did you see that?" Emily gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel nodded grimly. "We need to get inside." The door creaked open once more, and they rushed inside, slamming it shut behind them. The woman was sitting in the living room, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What's going on?" she asked in a whisper. "What did you see?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He was still trying to process what had happened outside, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that had been lurking in the town for far longer than he had realized. "There's something out there," he said finally. "I don't know what it is, but it's not human." Just as he spoke, the lights flickered. The room grew cold and the air felt heavy, as though it were pressing in on them. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. "Stay here," Daniel said, his voice hard as steel. He motioned for Emily to stay behind him. He opened the front door, stepping out into the yard once more. This time, he was ready. The truth. The figure emerged from the mist, taller than before, its face hidden beneath the hood of a tattered cloak. It moved toward them with a quiet, almost predatory grace. Its eyes were nothing but empty sockets, its mouth stretched into a horrific grin. "What are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice steady but his heart racing. "Show yourself." The creature stopped, tilting its head as though considering him. Then it spoke. Its voice was deep and gravelly, as though it came from the very earth itself. "Why do you resist?" it asked, its voice a chorus of whispers. "We have always been here." Daniel felt his knees weaken as the fog thickened around them. The thing was not just some creature, it was something ancient, something tied to the very land they stood on. You're the reason people vanish," Daniel whispered. The figure tilted its head again, a cold smile forming beneath its hood. "We are the shadows in the streets, the whispers in the dark," it said. "And now we have found you." The end the next morning, the house on Maple and Elm stood silent. No sign of the officers, no sign of the figure. Just another empty house, overgrown with weeds. The only thing left behind was a single large footprint in the yard, too deep, too uneven to belong to any human. And in Pine Hill, the stories continued to grow. Stories about the thing that lived in the fog, in the shadows, waiting for the next pair of officers to investigate. End. This story, told from the perspective of two police officers investigating strange events, builds tension with supernatural elements, psychological fear, and a sinister force lurking within a small, isolated town. It taps into deep fears of the unknown, with eerie, unsettling imagery, and a feeling that something ancient and malevolent is always watching. Officer Luke Chambers had worked the night shift for over a decade. He loved the stillness of the small Midwestern town of Clearwater after dark. It was the kind of place where you could count the streetlights on Main Street, and where nothing much happened, until it did. The legend of Deadman's Hollow was a running joke among Clearwater's officers, a spot that new recruits were always dared to patrol alone. The Hollow was a stretch of dense woods on the outskirts of town, near the state highway. Rumour had it that back in the 1950s, a Clearwater officer named Garrett Mallory went missing there while investigating a series of grisly murders. His body was never found. Older officers warned that strange things happened to anyone who lingered too long near the Hollow. Cars breaking down, radios emitting static-filled whispers, and shadowy figures spotted in the trees were all par for the course. Most officers played along with the myth for laughs, though nobody volunteered to patrol the area. Luke wasn't a superstitious man. After 15 years on the force, he figured he'd seen it all. Domestic violence calls, fatal car wrecks, the occasional meth lab. Clearwater wasn't glamorous, but it was his town. So, when a call came in one moonless night about a possible prowler near Deadman's Hollow, he took it without hesitation. The call. Unit 4-1, we've got a report of movement in the woods near mile marker 17, the dispatcher said. Got it, dispatch, Luke replied, trying to sound casual. On my way. The drive was uneventful at first. His cruiser's headlights illuminated the narrow county road, flanked on both sides by towering pines. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the darkness became. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches forming skeletal fingers that scraped the air. As he approached mile marker 17, his radio hissed with static. Luke frowned and adjusted the knob, but the noise didn't clear. Dispatch, this is Unit 4-1. I'm at the Hollow, starting my sweep, he said. No response, just more static. Luke pulled over, the gravel crunching under his tires. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, and scanned the woods. The air was unnaturally still, and the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, the distant rustle of animals, were absent. His beam caught the mile marker, its paint faded but still legible. Beyond it, the woods were a wall of darkness. He was about to call it in and leave when he heard it, a faint, high-pitched laugh like that of a child. Luke froze. His first instinct was that it was a prank, maybe some teenagers from town trying to spook the local cops. Clearwater PD, he called out, his voice firm. If someone's out there, show yourself. The laugh came again, closer this time. Luke's stomach tightened. He shined his flashlight into the woods, sweeping the beam across the gnarled trees. Then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. The first encounter. It was small, no taller than 4 feet, and stood perfectly still. The figure's pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Luke's first thought was that it was a child, but something about its proportions was off. The arms were too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. Hey, Luke shouted, stepping closer. Are you okay? Do you need help? The figure didn't move. Its head remained cocked as if it were examining him. Luke's instincts told him to back off, but training took over. He advanced cautiously, his flashlight steady. When he was about 10 feet away, the figure suddenly bolted deeper into the woods, moving faster than seemed humanly possible. Stop! Luke shouted, breaking into a run. His boots crunched on the underbrush as he pursued it. The flashlight's beam bounced wildly, illuminating twisted branches and the occasional flash of pale skin ahead. The chase didn't last long. The figure vanished, leaving Luke alone in the suffocating dark. His breath came in ragged gasps as he spun in place, trying to get his bearings. That's when he heard it again, the laugh. But now it came from all around him, echoing in the trees. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4-1, he said into his radio, his voice shaking. "I'm in the hollow, possible suspect in the woods, requesting backup." The static crackled, and for a moment he thought he heard a voice, but it wasn't dispatch. "Leave," the whisper said, faint and distorted. "Who is this?" Luke barked. "Identify yourself." The radio went dead. The lost patrol. Luke stumbled back toward the road, desperate to find his cruiser. The woods felt endless, the trees closing in tighter with every step. His flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker. Come on, he muttered, smacking it against his hand. Then he saw the lights, red and blue, flashing through the trees. Relief flooded him as he hurried toward them. But as he broke through the underbrush, he stopped cold. The cruiser was there, but it wasn't his. The car was ancient, a model from the 1950s. Its paint was chipped, the Clearwater PD logo barely visible on the rusted door. The lights continued to spin, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Luke approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The driver's door was open, and a faint smell of decay wafted from inside. On the seat lay an old leather notebook, its cover cracked with age. Luke picked it up, his fingers trembling. The first page was filled with shaky handwriting. "My name is Officer Garrett Mallory. If you're reading this, God help you. Don't trust the lights, don't follow the laughter, and for the love of God, don't stay after midnight." Luke's breath hitched. He looked at his watch. 12:07 a.m. The laughter returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping. He spun around, flashlight sweeping the woods. The pale figures were back, dozens of them, standing just beyond the tree line. Their blank faces stared at him, unblinking. Luke backed toward the cruiser, his pulse hammering in his ears. He climbed inside and tried the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4-1. I need backup now." Too late. The whisper came again, louder this time. The figures began to move, their long limbs jerking as they closed in. Luke slammed the door and started the engine. The ancient cruiser roared to life, and he floored the gas. The road appeared ahead, twisting and unfamiliar, but he didn't care. He drove blindly, the pale figures vanishing in the rearview mirror. Aftermath. When Luke finally emerged from the woods, the sky was beginning to lighten. He pulled over at the nearest gas station, shaking and drenched in sweat. The clerk looked at him oddly but didn't say anything. Luke tried to report the incident, but the dispatcher claimed no call had been made to Deadman's Hollow that night. His cruiser was found parked at mile marker 17, the keys still in the ignition. Luke took a leave of absence the next day. He never returned to Clearwater. Years later, a rookie officer patrolling near Deadman's Hollow found an old leather notebook in the woods. The name Garrett Mallory was scrawled on the inside cover, along with a single line, "The Hollow keeps what it takes." This story blends psychological horror with supernatural elements, creating an eerie tale of isolation and inescapable terror. Every officer at the Millstone Police Department had heard the stories, the ones shared in hushed tones during long night shifts when the coffee went cold and the radio fell silent. Most chalked them up to urban legends, gruesome tales passed down to spook rookies and entertain the veterans. But for Officer Rebecca Cole, those stories became hauntingly real one quiet October night. Rebecca was no rookie. 5 years on the force had hardened her resolve. She'd seen her share of horror, domestic disputes turned deadly, car accidents that left mangled bodies, and even a couple of bizarre, unexplained deaths. But nothing prepared her for what she encountered that night. The call came in at 2:13 a.m. Unit 3-7, we've got a report of a possible intruder at the old Carter Asylum. Caller states they heard screaming from inside. No lights, building's been abandoned for years. Proceed with caution. Rebecca groaned. The Carter Asylum had been shut down decades ago after funding dried up. The building was infamous, not just for its decrepit state but for the rumors surrounding it. Patients vanishing, experiments conducted in secret, and staff members found dead under mysterious circumstances. Still, a call was a call. As she pulled up to the building, the sight of the asylum sent a chill down her spine. The 3-story structure loomed against the moonlit sky, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The iron gate stood ajar, as if inviting her in. Rebecca stepped out of her cruiser, flashlight in hand. The silence was deafening. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. She radioed in her arrival. Unit 3 to 7 on scene, no sign of activity yet. Proceeding to investigate. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the cavernous lobby. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing overturned furniture, peeling wallpaper, and shards of glass littering the floor. Then she heard it, a faint, distant scream. It was high-pitched, almost inhuman. Rebecca froze, gripping her flashlight tighter. The sound came from deep within the building. Swallowing her fear, she followed the noise, her boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, each turn revealing more shadows and unsettling graffiti. One phrase, written repeatedly in what looked like red paint, stood out. "They see you." Her heart pounded as she reached the source of the noise, the basement stairwell. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. She hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't, not without knowing if someone needed help. As she descended the stairs, the temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the smell of rot grew stronger. At the bottom, her flashlight illuminated a door slightly ajar. It looked newer than the rest of the asylum, as if someone had replaced it recently. Rebecca pushed it open and stepped into what could only be described as a nightmare. The room was filled with surgical equipment, rusted and blood-stained. Chains hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered in more writing. Sacrifices must be made. Then she saw them, figures standing in the shadows at the edges of the room. They were unnaturally tall, their limbs elongated, faces obscured by darkness. Rebecca aimed her flashlight at them, but the beam seemed to bend around their forms, refusing to reveal their true shapes. "Millstone PD, identify yourselves," she demanded, her voice cracking. The figures didn't move. Instead, a guttural growl echoed through the room, reverberating in her chest. Panic set in. Rebecca drew her gun, backing toward the door, and then they moved. It wasn't a sprint or a lunge, they simply shifted, closer and closer, as if reality itself distorted around them. Her radio crackled to life, but the voice on the other end was garbled, unintelligible. Desperation clawed at her as she fired a warning shot. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but the figures didn't flinch. She turned and ran. The hallways seemed to warp and twist as she fled. Every door she passed was now closed, though she was certain many had been open moments before. The graffiti on the walls seemed to pulse, the words changing as she ran. "Don't look back." Her flashlight flickered, and for a horrifying moment, it went out completely. In the darkness, she felt something brush against her arm. Cold, bony fingers that sent a jolt of terror through her body. The light returned and she bolted faster. When she finally burst through the front doors, she collapsed on the steps, gasping for air. The asylum stood silent behind her, its windows dark and unyielding. Rebecca radioed for backup, her hands trembling. "This is Unit 3-7. I need assistance at the Carter Asylum. Possible intruders, hostile. Send backup now." But the response she received chilled her more than anything she had just experienced. "Unit 3-7, we don't have a record of a call to the Carter Asylum tonight. Are you sure of your location?" She stared at her cruiser, her heart sinking. The dashboard clock read 5:47 a.m. She had been inside for hours, though it felt like minutes. Backup arrived 20 minutes later. They searched the asylum thoroughly, but found no evidence of intruders. No fresh footprints, no disturbed dust. Even the phrases she'd seen scrawled across the walls were gone. Rebecca didn't sleep for days after that. She tried to rationalize what had happened, but the whispers from her colleagues haunted her. Stories of officers who went to the Carter Asylum and were never the same afterward. Months later, she handed in her resignation. The nightmares were relentless, shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. The words from the asylum followed her wherever she went. "They see you." Rebecca moved far away, but late at night, when the world was quiet, she swore she could hear faint screams in the distance, and she knew deep down that they weren't done with her yet. The town of Black Hollow had always been quiet. Nestled deep in the woods of northern Montana, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing much ever happened. At least, that's what the locals liked to say. But every cop who had worked the night shift in Black Hollow knew better. There was a road just outside of town, known only as Route 21. It was a dead-end stretch that led into the woods and stopped abruptly. swallowed by overgrown trees. Officially, it had been closed for decades due to erosion and safety concerns, but the real reason no one went there was the stories. People talked about strange lights in the woods, voices calling from the trees, and cars breaking down without explanation. Officers whispered about how their radios would go silent when they got too close, or how shadows seemed to move where there shouldn't have been any movement at all. Officer Jake Marlowe had heard all the stories. He was skeptical. Sure, he'd seen weird things in his 15 years on the force, but nothing that couldn't be explained. So when the dispatch came in that night about a stranded vehicle on Route 21, Jake didn't think twice about responding. The call. It was 11:34 p.m. when Jake's radio crackled. Unit 7, report of a vehicle stranded on Route 21 near mile marker 3. Caller stated engine failure and no cell service. Driver requested police assistance. Jake frowned, glancing at his dashboard clock. Copy that, dispatch, he replied. The drive out to Route 21 was uneventful. Jake's cruiser cut through the empty streets of Black Hollow, the headlights illuminating stretches of cracked pavement and frost-covered pine trees. He turned onto the old overgrown road and immediately felt the change in atmosphere. The trees loomed taller here, their branches tangling overhead like skeletal hands. Jake's radio emitted a faint hiss of static as he drove deeper. At mile marker 3, he spotted the car, a rusted sedan with its hazard lights flashing faintly in the darkness. He pulled up behind it, his cruiser's spotlight sweeping across the scene. The car looked abandoned. The driver's door was open and there was no one inside. Jake stepped out, the cold night air biting at his face. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. "This is Officer Marlowe with Black Hollow PD. Is anyone here?" No response. He shined his flashlight into the woods. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his holster. Something didn't feel right. The woods, Jake approached the car, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. The interior was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition. He leaned in, noting the faint smell of cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic like blood. Then he saw it, a trail of footprints leading away from the car and into the woods. The prints were uneven, as if the person had been limping or stumbling. "Great," Jake muttered. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I've got an abandoned vehicle on Route 21. Appears the driver left on foot, following a trail into the woods." The radio crackled, but there was no response. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Jake repeated. Nothing. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow the footprints. His flashlight illuminated the path, the beam flickering slightly as he moved deeper into the trees. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the sound of his own breathing. The trail led him to a clearing, where the ground was covered in frost and dead leaves. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. Jake froze. The figure was a man, his back turned to Jake. He was wearing a tattered coat, and his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if he were listening to something. In his hand he held a flashlight, but the beam pointed straight down, illuminating nothing. "Sir," Jake called out, keeping his distance. "Are you the owner of the vehicle? Do you need assistance?" The man didn't move. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. He reached for his gun. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around slowly and show me your hands." The man twitched, his shoulders jerking as if he were suppressing laughter. Then he turned. Jake's blood turned to ice. The man's face was wrong. His eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and his mouth stretched too wide as though it had been slit open at the corners. When he smiled, his teeth gleamed sharp and white in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here," the man said in a voice that wasn't human. It was layered, like several people speaking at once. The chase. Jake didn't wait to see what the man would do next. He raised his gun. "Stay where you are." The next day, when a tow truck was sent to retrieve the car, it was gone. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, just an empty road. Jake transferred to a precinct in another state a month later. He never spoke of what happened on Route 21 again, but sometimes, late at night, he would wake up to the sound of static and whispers, and he'd see those hollow eyes staring at him from the corner of his room. Route 21 remained closed, but the stories persisted. People still reported strange lights in the woods, or voices calling their names. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear the faint echo of gunshots and a man's voice shouting, Stay where you are. But no one ever stayed. No one ever came back. This atmospheric tale blends dread, suspense, and vivid imagery to captivate an audience seeking a truly chilling police horror story. Officer Emily Carter had always loved the serenity of the night shift. The quiet hours gave her time to think, to breathe, and to occasionally help those who genuinely needed her. Clearwater County was small, its crimes mostly petty thefts, noise complaints, and the occasional drunk driver. But the peace of the midnight patrol was something Emily cherished, until the night everything changed. It was a little after 2 a.m. when the call came through her radio. Unit 53, report of possible disturbance at Black Hollow. Caller reports seeing lights and hearing voices near the old Silver Pine Correctional Facility. No additional units available. Proceed with caution. Emily groaned. Black Hollow wasn't on her usual patrol route, but as the youngest officer on the team, she often got the calls no one else wanted. The old prison was infamous in Clearwater, a crumbling structure swallowed by forest. It had been abandoned in the 1970s after a fire killed over a dozen inmates. Since then, it was the subject of local legend, a magnet for thrill-seeking teenagers and whispered ghost stories. Still, a call was a call. "Copy that, dispatch," Emily replied, starting the car. "En route now." The road spurned to Silver Pine. The drive to Black Hollow was unnerving. The main road turned to dirt after a few miles, the trees growing denser as the cruiser bumped along the uneven path. Her headlights barely pierced the thick fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. The night was unusually silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of her engine. The prison loomed into view suddenly, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The building was massive, its stone walls cracked and weathered. Ivy had claimed much of the exterior, and the once imposing watchtowers now sagged like tired sentinels. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, her flashlight casting long shadows across the overgrown courtyard. "Unit 53, on scene at Silver Pine," she said into her radio. "Investigating the disturbance." The response was nothing but static. "Dispatch, do you copy?" She tried again. More static. Emily sighed, chalking it up to the remote location, and pressed on. Inside the prison. The front doors were ajar, the rusted hinges groaning as she stepped inside. Her flashlight illuminated a long, empty hallway, the walls peeling with decades of neglect. Faint graffiti covered the surfaces, mostly names and dates, but some messages stood out. They never left. Emily's footsteps echoed loudly as she walked, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic smell she couldn't place. The prison's layout was labyrinthine, and as she moved deeper, the oppressive silence began to weigh on her. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "Help me." She froze, her heart pounding. The voice was coming from somewhere ahead, barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. "Clearwater PD," she called out, her voice firm. "If someone's here, identify yourself." The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." Emily followed the sound cautiously, her flashlight revealing more of the decayed interior. She turned a corner and stopped cold. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was a man, his back to her, dressed in what looked like an old prison uniform. His head was bowed and his hands hung limply at his sides. "Sir, are you okay?" she called, taking a step forward. The man didn't move. "Sir, I'm here to help. Please turn around slowly." The man's head twitched, and then, with a jerking motion, he turned to face her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. His face was wrong. His eyes were empty sockets, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched impossibly wide. The skin on his face looked stretched, as though it didn't belong to him. Before Emily could react, the figure let out a blood-curdling scream and vanished into thin air. The descent. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Her mind raced to rationalize what she'd just seen, but nothing made sense. She tried her radio again, desperation creeping into her voice. "Dispatch, this is Unit 53. I need backup at Silver Pine. Something is not right." The static crackled, and for a moment, she thought she heard a response, but it wasn't dispatch. "Leave. Now." Her blood ran cold. The voice was low and guttural, layered with static. Before she could process it, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Heavy, deliberate steps as if someone or something was approaching. Emily turned and ran. The hallways twisted and turned, each one looking more decayed than the last. Her flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each step. She could feel something behind her, a presence she couldn't see but knew was there. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the weak light. She rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. The hallway ahead was filled with figures, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still. Their bodies were gaunt, their faces shrouded in shadow. Emily backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The figures began to move, their heads tilting unnaturally as they turned to face her. One of them stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice a sickening chorus of whispers. Emily bolted, the figures closing in behind her. She ran blindly, her flashlight flickering out completely. The darkness was suffocating, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. Escape. She finally burst through the front doors, gasping for air. The courtyard was eerily still, the fog thicker than before. Emily sprinted to her cruiser and threw herself inside, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life and she floored the gas. The trees blurred past as she sped down the dirt road, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The radio crackled and a voice came through, clear, calm, and familiar. "Unit 5-3, what's your status?" It was dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Unit 5-3, Emily said, her voice shaking. "I'm clear of Silver Pine. Send backup immediately. There's something..." The radio cut out. When Emily finally reached town, she parked in front of the station and stumbled inside. Her colleagues looked up in surprise as she entered, pale and trembling. "What happened?" one of them asked. Emily tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She just shook her head, her mind replaying the nightmarish images over and over. Aftermath. The next day, a search team was sent to Silver Pine. They found her cruiser parked at the gate, the engine still running. Inside the prison, they found no sign of disturbance, no figures, no voices, nothing. But near the entrance, carved into the wall, was a single message: "She saw us." Emily never returned to the force. She moved to another state, far from Clearwater, and refused to talk about that night. But late at night, when the world was quiet, she swore she could still hear them, the whispers in the dark calling her back. This version fills out the full character limit with detailed descriptions, mounting suspense, and a lingering sense of dread. Perfect for a chilling tale. The police force in Coldwater, a small, remote town tucked away in the thick forests of West Virginia, had always been a tight-knit group. There weren't many calls, and when they did come, it was mostly petty thefts or drunk drivers. But the officers who had worked there long enough all shared a quiet understanding. There were places in Coldwater that weren't meant to be explored, and certain calls that never seemed to have answers. Sergeant David Moore had been with the Coldwater Police Department for over 10 years. He'd seen the way new recruits reacted to the town's eerie quietness, and he had always chalked it up to the isolation and the town's eerie reputation. But there was one thing about Coldwater that never left him: the chilling stories from his colleagues, stories that didn't belong in official reports. It started one cold November evening. The wind howled through the trees and an unease settled over the town. David's partner, Officer Jenna Hayes, had been quiet all night. The kind of quiet where you knew something was off, but she wasn't ready to talk about it yet. The unsettling call. The night shift had started like any other, but around midnight the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled through David's radio. "Unit 3, we've got a 911 call coming from the old Whitmore house near the woods. Caller reports hearing noises inside, says it's been abandoned for years. No one's supposed to be there." David frowned. The Whitmore house was a local legend, known for being the site of mysterious disappearances and strange occurrences. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the Whitmore family had vanished without a trace. The house was a dilapidated relic, surrounded by dense woods, and most people in Coldwater avoided it at all costs. David had heard the stories. People claimed they saw shadows moving inside at night, heard children laughing, and sometimes even saw figures watching them from the windows. "Got it," David said, his voice steady despite the shiver crawling up his spine. He glanced at Jenna, who was still silent, staring out the window. "You good?" She nodded without speaking, the unease in her eyes telling him everything he needed to know. The Whitmore house. The house stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the woods, its dark silhouette barely visible through the thick mist. As they pulled up to the overgrown driveway, David could feel the air grow colder. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisted and gnarled as if reaching out for the car. David parked the cruiser, and they both stepped out into the cold. The house loomed ahead, its windows shattered, the front porch sagging with age. The whole place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet the faintest light flickered behind the broken windows. "Didn't the Whitmores disappear decades ago?" Jenna whispered, her breath forming a cloud in the night air. "Yeah," David muttered. "But the stories, they never stopped." They approached the front door, which creaked ominously as David pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, and the smell of mildew was almost overpowering. Their flashlights flickered in the darkness as they stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. David's hand rested on the grip of his sidearm as he scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the strange feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. "Hello?" David called out. "This is Sergeant Moore and Officer Hayes, Coldwater PD. Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the distant sound of wind howling through the cracks in the walls. They continued deeper into the house, passing through what had once been a living room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and old furniture lay abandoned, covered in dust and cobwebs. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching them. Jenna stopped suddenly, her flashlight flicking over a framed photograph on the wall. She stepped closer to examine it. It was a picture of a family, 2 parents, a young boy, and a girl. But the eyes of the people in the photo were wrong. They seemed too dark, too hollow, as if they were staring right through her. "David, look at this," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's off about this picture." Before David could respond, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. The stairs. The sound of something heavy falling echoed through the house. David's heart raced as he motioned for Jenna to follow him. They carefully made their way up the staircase, the wood creaking under their feet. As they reached the top, the smell of rot intensified. At the end of the hallway there was a door slightly ajar. The source of the noise had to be behind it. David nodded to Jenna, and they both silently approached the door. He pushed it open with his shoulder, his flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. What they saw made their blood run cold. There, in the center of the room, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its back hunched and its arms hanging limply at its sides. The figure was completely still, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. As they stood there, frozen in shock, the figure slowly turned its head toward them. Its eyes were hollow, black voids, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, too wide for any human to possess. David's hand instinctively reached for his gun, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it opened its mouth wide, and a voice, distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, whispered, "Get out." The words weren't just spoken, they were felt, reverberating in David's skull. His vision blurred and his limbs went heavy, like his body was fighting against some invisible force. "David!" Jenna screamed, her voice barely audible over the whispering. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the door. They ran, the chase. The figure didn't follow them, but the oppressive feeling in the house only grew stronger as they descended the stairs. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in around them. David could hear whispers now, not just from the house, but from the woods outside, from the very ground beneath their feet. They reached the front door, but as David reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. He turned to Jenna, panic rising in his chest. "Do you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The whispers had stopped, but the house was alive with a new sound, a low, guttural growl coming from the walls themselves. David didn't hesitate. He fired his gun at the door, the shot echoing in the claustrophobic space. The door splintered, and they burst through it, stumbling into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they reached the cruiser. Breathless, they jumped into the car, and David floored the accelerator. As they sped away from the Whitmore house, David glanced back through the rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw something in the reflection, a pale face with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, staring at him from the window of the house. The aftermath. The following days were a blur. The Whitmore house was investigated by other officers, but when they arrived it was completely empty. No signs of the figure, no evidence of anything strange. It was as though nothing had ever happened. David and Jenna both submitted reports, but there was no way to explain what they had seen. The house was checked for structural damage, but no one could explain why the door had slammed shut or why the whispers had seemed so real. David tried to move on, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, he saw the figure in his dreams, its hollow eyes, its twisted grin. Sometimes he could still hear the whispers, faint but insistent. Jenna left the force soon after, her nerves shattered by what they had witnessed. She never spoke to David again. As for David, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. The stories of Coldwater weren't just stories, they were warnings. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees, David could swear he heard the whispers again, calling his name. End. This story, blending a chilling supernatural encounter with psychological horror, would definitely captivate an audience, especially in a setting like Coldwater, a small, isolated town with eerie tales surrounding it.